I'm very pleased to be here with you today, and both of us are, of course. This topic is always a challenge for the deaf community and deaf children and deaf people around the world. The WFD is also a member of the International Disability Alliance, IDA, which is a consortium of 8 international NGOs and then 4 regional NGOs who all work together with the aim of the betterment of disabled children, and in our case specifically deaf children, and also deaf-blind children are represented in IDA. And I'm coming as a representative of the World Federation of the Deaf. The World Federation of the Deaf has 133 countries around the world who are member associations of the deaf. We have a large membership. We have over 60 years experience. We're 60 years old as an international NGO, to give you a little bit of background about the WFD. And we have a vision. This is it. That deaf people, as people, have the full range of human rights in an equal world where they and their different sign languages, because there are different sign languages all around the world, are recognized and included as a part of human diversity. And that vision relates to the discussion paper in question in several ways. We can all contribute to the vision of what early childhood intervention will look like, and certainly the WFO has provided you with the basis for discussion. In reading the document, there were several things that hit me. First of all, page number 24, I believe it is. Yes. And page number 25. On page 24, the last paragraph, it reads, children in deaf schools and blind schools, or children who are mainstreamed but in special rooms, resource rooms, or self-contained classrooms, either deaf or blind children. The discussion paper states that these kinds of programs in these schools are a failure if the aim is eventual integration into the community. On page 25 also it says that special schools, deaf schools, or schools especially for the blind, are not as cost effective, are very expensive. And that mainstreaming or inclusive education is more cost effective. So in looking at these two passages, the WFD viewpoint is a little bit different. There was no direct conversation with the World Federation of the Deaf before this discussion paper was published, but I'm glad to participate in this open forum to see how our vision, in fact, can be attained through inclusive education. And I would like Jenny Nilsson to speak after I do. We are representing about 72 million deaf people in the world. And only about 17% receive an education in that group of 72 million. 17%. Any kind of education. And only 3% of those children around the world receive any instruction in sign language. And a bilingual education for us includes, of course, sign language, our primary language, plus the written language of the country where we live. That is bilingualism. We do have a youth section at the World Federation of the Deaf. And this group, the youth section, is responsible for focusing on youth issues and deaf children around the world. So I'd like to pass the floor to Jenny Nilsson, the president of our youth section.
Thank you, Colin. I too am very glad to be here because there are a few issues that are as important as this one. I want to talk about what it means to have a good education through the eyes of a deaf person, particularly a child, someone who's young. It starts with Article 24, that in there it says that the goal is that deaf children, the persons with disabilities, should not be out of school or not educated or excluded in any way, and they use that word excluded. But the opposite of excluded is not inclusive. There are other options, there are other choices that foster the educational experience of young people who go to whatever school they're going to. And they need to use sign language so that they can develop a healthy identity of who they are as people, young people, and who they will become. They need to be around other deaf people to be able to learn the social skills of speaking with people that later transfers to people who are not deaf and disabled. For deaf children, they need to be able to have friends, to have teachers who can communicate directly to them in sign language, not through some other service. Schools should be providing education in sign language, absolutely. And deaf teachers should be providing that education because it should be given in sign language so that they can access the information directly and naturally. It is good to talk about inclusive education in some ways. If it's made the norm, but there's no definition of what inclusive education means, I think, particularly in this document. And for all of us working in the field, I think we need to spend some time to understand what inclusive is and not define it in one way. I think we need to have greater dialogue about the things I've talked about that needs to be in an education for a deaf person, and have better dialogue among all of the stakeholders about the 5 requirements of an inclusive education for deaf people. Accessibility is the first. And accessibility for people that are deaf is different depending on the individual. There are deaf people who use sign language and who get all of their information through their sign language. You need to have visual accessibility. That means schools can't have information that comes over a loudspeaker. It needs to have information that's visual and posted on walls, and notices are in a way that a deaf person can access without being told from someone else what's going on. Direct. Visual, that means visual fire alarms. It means notice boards that are visual and not auditory based. It means the entire universal design of where a place education takes place. Like, look at a room, for example. Deaf people need to look at each other directly, almost in a circular fashion, so that you can follow someone else's conversation when they're being given in a visual language instead of the old traditional, everyone looks in one direction. The other thing is there can be no discrimination in these settings. Schools need to have equality in every event, after school, school, and there shouldn't be anyone walking in the hall who's talking so that students and other professionals have no access to what's going on. There should be no barriers to access. The school needs to follow and evaluate what the individual student needs and make sure that the services are tailored to that student. Which means you have to have a dialogue with the children. You have to have a dialogue with them. And the fifth point, I would say, is that there has to be reasonable accommodations. Without thought to it costs too much money, therefore we can't do it, and take some kind of a shortcut. Those are the 5 things that I say are very important in having the type of education that leads to a quality education. And schools should follow those. And without them, they'd be isolated. Thank you so much for the time to be able to speak. I just have a short film I'd like to show you. It's a short video that'll kind of, when you see this, you'll understand what I'm talking about.
I think Amy will sort that.
I just recently, I just recently went to the Australian Disability Alliance meeting a couple of weeks ago, and saw that AusAid, the Australian Governmental Aid Projects, has been doing this project in Samoa, on the island of Samoa. We just wanted to show you a few different kinds of ways that they're experimenting with to relate to disabled students. And one way to relate to deaf students as deaf people. And this is a very short clip, but we do want you to take a look at it.
Okay. We actually require technical assistance to be able to run it. So as a result, what I'm going to